Hello and welcome to the University of Mississippi Slavery Research Group tour. This tour is to better contextualize the history of the institution of slavery on the campus of the University of Mississippi. As part of this tour, we will visit the Lyceum, Barnard Observatory, Croft, the contextualization plaque at the University Circle, the former site of the Confederate statue, Ventress Hall, as well as other locations. Our first stop is the Lyceum. It is one of the earliest university buildings, one of the four extant mid-19th century buildings on campus today. It was built between 1846 and 1848 when the university opened. There was an addition in 1858, but the wings were not added until 1903. The design is Greek Revival, and the bricks were likely made from clay available on campus and in the nearby area. The original campus consisted of a series of buildings around the circle where students and faculty worked and lived. It presents two important moments in the history of the University of Mississippi and in U.S. history. First, it served as a hospital during the Civil War. And a century later, it was the location of a riot where 3 people died as James Meredith enrolled and integrated the University of Mississippi in 1962. These two events in U.S. history, as well as in university history, give us an indication about how much the university has changed over time and how much it continues to change. The University of Mississippi was created in an effort to stem the tide of abolitionism. In fact, many of the local planters were beginning to get uncomfortable with sending their sons to northern universities and felt as though their exposure to abolitionist causes at those universities would lend them to being a little bit less receptive to the institution of slavery. As a result, these men wanted universities, or at least a university in the local area in which they could control the curriculum, control the administration, and determine what faculty members were to be hired. They wanted a safe area to provide education and formal training to their sons and to continue the institution of slavery. The students who first matriculated to the university were predominantly from Mississippi. A small number were from Alabama and from Tennessee. These students were generally very wealthy and came from slaveholding families. When the university opened on November 6 of 1848, 2 prominent individuals gave speeches that gave us an indication about the genesis of the university. Jacob Thompson, Mississippi Congressman from the 1st District, and George Frederick Holmes, the first Chancellor of the University of Mississippi. The founding of the university and its place within American society. Jacob Thompson stated, "Moreover, there is a growing disposition manifest to us all in different portions of the world and of the United States to denounce and vilify our institutions which have come down to us from a remote ancestry. On the maintenance of these institutions in its integrity and full enjoyment, our prosperity, safety, and happiness depend. We can never look to expediency. Necessity alone is the ruling consideration, and it is of the last importance to us that the hearts of our young men should be kept in the right place, and it is verily a sin against our children to send them into that circle of fanaticism which surrounds our northern colleges." In his speech, George Frederick Holmes stated, "The mad spirit of abolitionism, so rife in the present day, travesty or deride the language of the Scriptures, and make mockery of the express commandments and the recognized ordinances of God." 4 years later, on July 15th of 1852, the University of Mississippi's 2 antebellum literary societies invited Jefferson Davis to deliver an address that challenged students and other attendees to defend slavery and the state of Mississippi against ideological attacks. His remarks took place at an annual event during which the Phi Sigma Society and the Hermann Society celebrated their founding by bringing a well-known speaker to Oxford. Since there was a mandate that each student join a literary society, it seems very likely that every student attended this address. But Davis's comments were almost certainly heard by every faculty member and many residents of Oxford as well. Before this crowd, which had assembled at the Oxford Methodist Episcopal Church, Davis warned of a coming crisis and described ideological assaults on the institution of slavery. He stated, An unholy crusade has been directed against the domestic institution of the South, under the pretext of a holy horror of the existence of that African slavery which has continued among us after it had ceased to be profitable among our assailants. In vain have appeals been made to the requirements of the Constitution and the duties of the states. All obligations, social and political, these self-canonized saints proclaim to be annulled by the higher law revealed to them, and which was theirs to execute, though ruin should be thus brought upon a section, and misery be the future lot of both the happy races now inhabiting it. Religion has been perverted from its mission of peace, goodwill, and brotherly love, to sanctify this unprovoked hostile aggression, and the word of God offered as authority for the commission of half the crime defined by the Decalogue. Davis characterized the rising tide of abolitionism in the North as the most dangerous agitation which has ever disturbed our Union. And like Jacob Thompson and George Frederick Holmes, he suggested the college should instill a fierce loyalty to the state of Mississippi and slavery in their students. Davis told the students they could potentially play a key role in maintaining slavery by stating, "To you, the young men of Mississippi and the students of her university, I especially look for the protection of her rights. From you I expect such keen sensibility to her fame and her honor as sons feel for their mother, and that community of sentiment which gives strength." It's important to consider that between 1848 and 1850, 172 students matriculated to the University of Mississippi. Of the 145 that were identified in the 1850 census, at least 138 were either slaveholders in their own right or had parents or guardians who were. Collectively, these 138 slaveholding students or their families owned over 4,600 enslaved people. Some of the students on the record, there were roughly 2, their fathers owned just 2 slaves each. The average holdings of University of Mississippi students and their families was 34 slaves each, which placed these students, parents, and guardians among an elite group, the top 20% of slaveholders in Mississippi and the top 10% of slaveholders nationwide. All the original Board of Trustees, 12 members, they were slaveholders. In all, they themselves owned more than 700 slaves. James Ventris came to Mississippi from Tennessee and had a plantation near Natchez, where in 1850 he held over 150 enslaved people. Another member of this board was Jacob Thompson, who came from North Carolina and had a plantation near Oxford, where he himself owned over 140 enslaved persons. Now, to consider the financial issues that are present here, if you were to take the value of an average field hand, which was around $1,000, and adjust it for today's dollars, you're looking at $40,000 per slave. The value of enslaved persons that were held by people like Jacob Thompson or James Ventris, you're looking at anywhere from $5.5 to $6 million in today's money. If you were to add up all the enslaved persons that were owned by the Board of Trustees, by the students and their families, and possibly by other faculty members, you're looking at a total worth in today's dollars as $250 million in value that was held in the bodies of those enslaved people. It's going to take us to the Barnard Observatory. Began in 1857 and was completed in 1859. The building is named after Frederick Augustus Porter Barnard, the third Chancellor of the University of Mississippi. Augustus Porter Barnard was the third Chancellor of the University of Mississippi. He was a complicated figure in that he was pro-science, very religious. He was a Northerner, but he was also pro-slavery. In fact, he owned 2 enslaved persons while he was here at the University of Mississippi. Being a man of science, he wanted to ensure that the University of Mississippi would become a leader in science and mathematics and rival the universities in the Northeast. As part of this plan, he commissioned the creation of a large, in fact, the largest refracting lens telescope of the time that would be held at the University of Mississippi. Because it was such a time-consuming, very labor-intensive and expensive process to create this device, the telescope was not completed until after Barnard had left the university and until after the war had taken place. And by the time the construction of this was created, it was unsafe to send a large refracting telescope that could be easily damaged, especially when crossing through war zones. Didn't make sense to send it to the University of Mississippi. So it was then diverted to Northwestern University, where it still sits to this day. Aside from the focus on science, one other thing that brought a lot of attention to Barnard is a feature known as the Branham Affair, and it involved one of his enslaved workers, an enslaved worker by the name of Jane. Now, Jane was a slave owned by Barnard, and she worked and lived as a domestic slave in the chancellor's private residence on the campus of the University of Mississippi. On the evening of May 11th, 1859, while Chancellor Barnard and his wife were out of town, a University of Mississippi student by the name of S.B. Humphreys entered the chancellor's home and raped Jane. After recovering from her injuries, Jane identified her attacker, and the chancellor expelled Humphreys from the university. The punishment administered to the student, not the attack, the sexual assault upon Jane, was the focus of some of the people in the local area. In fact, the leading investigator, a local Oxford doctor by the name of H.R. Branham, pushed charges against the chancellor for taking the word of an African American female slave over the word of a white male student. As a result, the Board of Trustees decided to keep Barnard in his place at the university. But the local community did not feel secure in having Barnard leading this university after he had taken the action of taking a word of his enslaved worker over the word of a young white male. They deemed him to be insufficiently pro-slavery. He wasn't necessarily an abolitionist, but he was insufficiently pro-slavery. So this in itself could be seen as a crack, or at least something that would lead to a push for abolitionism in the South. And they did not want that to be received at this university. They did not want it to be extended to this community. And Barnard decided to take the attention off of himself and take the attention away from the university and actually resign his position and take one at Columbia University. And after Barnard, we will now be going to the Croft Building. The Croft Building served as a Civil War hospital, but was originally built as a chapel in 1853. But the building itself, as well as the Lyceum and Barnard, also give us an indication about the labor that was performed by the enslaved workers on campus, as well as leaves a legacy behind, indicating exactly the impact that enslaved workers had here. Now, the clay that you see on the building itself, whether we're talking about the Lyceum, Barnard, or Croft, the clay that was used for those bricks came from the local community. And it was a very painstaking process, but it involved finding patches of red clay, digging out that area, and then forming kilns in those areas that you would then fire up in order to cook and cure the clay. But before you could do that, the clay had to be formed by hand into bricks, and they would have to be dried out in the sun, because the more moisture you have in those bricks, the more volatile situation you could create. So because this was being done by hand, the bricks themselves were not always uniform. They were as uniform as possible, but you had a lot of inconsistencies. You had a lot of imperfections that were created as a result. It was conducted. Many imperfections were left behind. And this could have been just the curvature of a brick or the way it wasn't fully formed. But something else that was left behind in many of the bricks, whether we're talking about the Lyceum, the Barnard Observatory, whether we're talking about Croft, we find finger impressions of enslaved workers on the facings of those buildings. And for generations, these finger impressions have hidden in plain sight. Now, students in anthropology, and we've also had historians who've come to this campus who discovered these impressions in the bricks years ago. And one historian in particular, Joe McGill, identified the fingerprints on several of these antebellum buildings, and from his research determined that many of them were way too small to have been made by adults, which means that children would have participated in this difficult manual labor of forming the bricks and helping to cure and carry the bricks themselves. Now, to give those of you who are looking at this an indication of the finger impression size on this one brick, on your left is the hand of a 5-year-old child as she is touching the bricks, and her fingers perfectly match the brick that you see to the right, which is, of course, the same brick. Just adjacent to the Croft building is the enslaved laborer plaque that was installed in 2017. Another figure to consider when we're talking about this area of Croft and where the enslaved laborer plaque is discussing the Phi Sigma Society. The Phi Sigma Society was a university debate society, and they took extensive notes at their meetings about campus events and, of course, the meeting minutes. And the University of Mississippi Slavery Research Group, in finding these notes, were able to piece together a lot of things as far as the labor that enslaved workers did, the daily conditions, but it was all coming from the pen of Phi Sigma members. And one of those Phi Sigma members, Francis Fentress, stated, or at least found a moment where in a meeting they were arguing about, scheduling an academic debate or determining what they were going to do. And Fentress came up with the idea of, hey, there are some abolitionist books in our library. We need to burn them. So in the notes, in a lot of the notes that they were taking, University of Mississippi Slavery Research Group determined that the enslaved workers on campus were responsible for any number of functions. Things like emptying the trash, cleaning rooms, cleaning quarters, bringing food, bringing water, a lot of different things. And one of those things that they were responsible for was also setting fires on campus. So, to dispose of trash or, lighting fires within the buildings to keep them warm. But Fentress himself called for the destruction of these books and stated that, it needed to be done. We need to destroy these monographs because they may be too abolitionist or at least not pro-slavery enough for us. And they ended up hiring out a couple of the enslaved laborers to clean that meeting room, and then specifically tasked them to build a fire. And build a fire in order to burn these books. And to think about the irony of these books potentially have ideas or concepts or philosophy that relates to freeing people who are in bondage. And these young men are so fearful of what those books state that they have their enslaved laborers burn these books who possibly can't even read these books. Tried to identify as many enslaved workers on this campus as possible, but names remain elusive and the work continues. When this plaque was installed in 2017, it listed the names George, Jane, Henry, John, Squash, Moses, Will, and Nathan. And these were all discovered in the notes of the Fraternal Debate Society Phi Sigma. And from continuing research, members of the University of Mississippi Slavery Research Group discovered the names Isaac, Simon, Harrison Stearns. Now, it's important to understand the level of information that is now accessible, is now understanding, and how that changes the narrative for these men and women. Earlier in the tour, I discussed enslaved workers in the aspect of numbers, whether we're talking about numerical units or we're talking about monetary. Talking about them in numbers. And even the language itself changes over time. If you look at this plaque, it says the university's enslaved laborers. This is an attempt to rehumanize people who were dehumanized by an institution. It's about making their lives value, making their lives count, making their lives matter, and making their history matter for that matter. See these names because when you see these names, you then begin to see these people. And more importantly, you see them as people as opposed to things. And that's what the institution of slavery did. It reduced human beings to things. So as part of this process with the University of Mississippi Slavery Research Group, it is to rehumanize these individuals. It is to reestablish their status so that people do not look at them uh, as as something that we can continue to overlook. Words on paper or words etched into a plaque are one thing. They give us some part of the story. It helps us see a little bit better, but it doesn't help us see fully. Images give us a little bit better indication of what life may have been like. So in roughly 1860, a new chemistry professor by the name of Edward Boynton uh, created a new film developing solution. And in order to try it out, he needed to take pictures. He needed to take images to develop. And he ended up taking pictures all throughout the campus in order to do this and test out his new solution. In one of the images that he takes, one of the photos that he takes, he leaves us a very good artifact that helps us rehumanize individuals that were going through the, the, the institution of slavery. Carriage house. And in this picture, we can clearly see three figures. On the far right stands Boynton's wife, Mary Hubbard Boynton, in a very long dress. On the far left, we see his 6-year-old daughter, Liza, dressed in petticoats and a sporty brimmed hat. And in the middle, framed by the opening of the carriage house, stands an African American woman wearing a long cotton dress with a white collar and a scarf covering her head. She rests her right hand on the handle of a wheeled bassinet, likely holding Boynton's 4-month-old baby, Florence. We don't know the name of this woman, nor do we know anything about her life attending to the Boynton family and caring for the Boynton children, but she is likely the person listed as a sole slave owned by Boynton in the 1860 Federal Slave Schedule. Her age, 45. Her sex, female. Her color, black. While the photograph connotes her probable role as a nanny to the Boynton children, her image, this fragile trace of her life, serendipitously preserved as the only image of antebellum slavery at the University of Mississippi found to date, leaves us with many questions. What was her name? Who was she? What was her life like? What was her relationship to her owners and masters, the Boyntons? What did her work entail? Where exactly on campus did she live? What was her relationship to the university? And most importantly, what was her relationship to the other dozens, perhaps hundreds of African American enslaved people who worked on the University of Mississippi campus and in the surrounding town of Oxford during the antebellum period? Was her experience similar to those who worked the campus fields and gardens that provided for the student meals in the steward's hall or the cooks and waiters who served those meals? Was it different from those who labored in the fire and handmade bricks and construct the earliest campus buildings, such as Lyceum and the observatory? Did she interact with the other slaves who undertook the domestic chores of caring for the students and faculty, building their fires in the morning, making their beds, laundering their clothes, making their meals, and emptying their chamber pots? As of yet, we don't know answers to any of these questions because Boynton's slave, as far as we know, left no letters or documents of her own. It is unlikely that she could even read or write, though she may have been able to do so. Like most of her enslaved contemporaries, her life is shrouded in obscurity, almost completely absent from the material traces typically left by society's more privileged citizens. Not even the federal government, required by law to enumerate every individual in the nation every 10 years, asked for her name. To Ventris Hall. Ventris Hall was built in 1889 and named after James Ventris, considered one of the founding fathers of the university, which was meant to provide a Southern education for Southern men. Inside of Ventris, there are 3 panels of Tiffany stained glass commemorating the university grays. Donated by Delta Gamma in 1889, has 3 panels. One showing students drilling in front of Barnard Hall. Another panel portrays a battle scene with the battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia. Some have stated this middle panel shows the Grays at First Manassas, and others have stated that the panel portrays Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, during which the Grays suffered 100% casualties. A third panel depicts the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Now our next stop takes us across the street at the former site of the Confederate statue on the University Circle. In 1906, a local chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy decided to commission the building of a Confederate statue at the Circle of the University of Mississippi. This statue stood until the summer of 2020 when it was relocated to the Confederate Cemetery. A contextualization plaque was installed at the base of the statue. The statue itself had been a rallying point for several moments in the university's history. In 1962, students who were opposed to the integration of the university and the enrollment of James Meredith, as well as members of the community and people from outside of the community, rallied around the statue to protest his enrollment and the potential desegregation of the university. Again, in 2008, the statue was used by people who were opposed to Senator Barack Obama's candidacy for president when he and Senator McCain came to the University of Mississippi as part of the presidential debates. Our next stop takes us to Hilgard Cut. Hilgard Cut is one of the largest construction projects engineered and built by enslaved people working on the campus. In 1856, construction of the Mississippi Central Railroad was in its planning stages, but would bypass the university still less than a decade old. One of the major stockholders was also a university trustee. He wanted the railroad rerouted through Oxford. As a result, the university mobilized a labor force, people enslaved by some familiar names, men who have buildings named after them on campus, such as Isom, Brown, Lamar, and Thompson. These people were forced to dig this massive cut in 1857, which has been described as a hand-dug, man-made canyon that we now see. An Oxford newspaper article described the satisfaction of the president of the railroad with the labor, who stated it was highly satisfactory, as it was free of strikes, drunkenness, and other labor troubles so frequently experienced by railway builders in the northern states. As a result of all this labor, slaveholders accepted payment for the work done by their slaves in company stock and not by cash. Now, what happened to all these people after slavery ended? Some left, went north, or like many enslaved people freed by the end of the Civil War, went to look for family members. On average, an enslaved person might be sold 2 to 3 times in his or her life. Accounts of former enslaved people tell that sometimes as a small child with no notice, they were taken from their mothers and were never seen by them or other family members again. Most stayed in the South and formed communities, helping to build the rich social fabric of the South today. One of these examples can be seen in the city of Oxford. Harrison Stearns was an enslaved man owned by University of Mississippi law professor William Forbes Stearns. It is not clear what, if any, work he did for the university specifically, rather than for Professor Stearns, or whether he resided on campus. When Professor Stearns left the University of Mississippi at the start of the Civil War, he entrusted Harrison Stearns with the maintenance of his property. Stearns had returned to Oxford once following the war, and during his time in Oxford, he met with Harrison. During Stearns' time in Oxford, he and Harrison came to an agreement regarding the property. William Forbes Stearns agreed to transfer all of his property to Harrison once Mississippi law allowed him to hold property. When William Forbes Stearns died, Harrison quickly found out, and he wrote to Stearns' widow expressing condolences and asking for the property. Harrison Stearns eventually took control of the property, and he used it to help build up the African American community in Oxford. Harrison Stearns became one of 3 freedmen to serve as Oxford alderman in 1870, and he conveyed a portion of his new land to the trustees of the Burns Methodist Episcopal Church of Oxford. The Burns Belfry Church is now a museum and multicultural center in Oxford. The pro-slavery founders, faculty, and students of this university in the antebellum years would have never expected or wanted Harrison Stearns to have this kind of influence on Oxford's history. But Harrison Stearns and the other enslaved people who worked on this campus or in Oxford must be remembered and studied in order for this university to fully understand its history. I want to thank all of you for taking this tour. You can follow us on Twitter at @toursum or on our website, slaveryresearchgroup.olemiss.edu. Thank you.